Okay, so here we go, and we're going to talk about ecology. And what we'll start with is the tropical rainforests. What I do want you to realize is, unfortunately, the tropical rainforests are being wiped out at an alarming rate. What you're seeing here is they cover about 7% of the Earth's dry land surface, but they're known to have over 50% of all plants and animals on the planet. They kind of go along the belt. You can see in the map there, right across the equator. And the picture at the bottom is showing you some degradation that's happened. What we find out is when we put roads in there, they disappear. And unfortunately, people do predict that we might lose all our functional tropical rainforests in the next 20 years. We're losing, and that number varies, but we're losing about 50 acres every single minute. Some bigger, some worse. Brazil is on fire. California is on fire, but we're burning, and we'll talk about those topics later. But definitely an issue. The reasons you should care: 3 reasons. Actually, there might be 4, and I'm going to add that one to it. But one is extinction. Again, we're talking biodiversity. And we are reducing biodiversity just by destroying the tropical rainforest. We're losing species we don't even know exist. Number 2 is increased global warming or climate change. What we're finding out is it's drying out the planet. Actually, these trees put out moisture through transpiration. And as we cut it down, we are finding out that it is getting drier and drier, more desertification, more desert areas. And it's definitely changing weather patterns. So number 2 would be global weather patterns. And number 3 would be regional weather patterns. And so we're seeing it all over. Just climate change in general, or destruction in general is saying that. But so, and the 4th one that has been in National Geographic is that some of these world diseases that we are seeing are actually harbored in the tropical rainforest. And when you say, well, shit, let's cut it down, let's get rid of it, that's a good idea. The problem is when they're in the tropical rainforest and they are secluded, they don't pose a world threat. But the fact that we are going in there, we're clearing it out, we are now in there. Some of these have jumped species, some of these diseases. And so they say that we have this new pandemic. It could get worse. All right, let's look at the 4 major components of the Earth's life support systems. The atmosphere. I want you to know that's broken into 2 parts. The troposphere, which is what we use. That's the breathing. It extends up to 12 miles. At the poles, it's only like 3 or 4 miles above. But that is the air we breathe. Mostly actually it's nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen. Oxygen is actually only about 21%. You live in California, that might be 18. We might even be lower now with the fires. But the stratosphere is everything above that. And this is 11 to 31 miles above the Earth. Before you get into what we call outer space. The lower portion has the ozone layer, which is important. The ozone layer actually gives us UV protection. Ozone is not good for us, and we'll talk about air pollution and ozone numbers in LA, especially in LA. Ozone is very high, very harmful. But when it is above in the stratosphere, it is actually there to protect us. All right, and then we have the hydrosphere, which we kind of already talked about with chapter 11, and that would contains all the water near the Earth's surface. And so that would be the hydrologic cycle that we talked about with last week. Then we have the geosphere, and that is broken up into several layers. We have the core, which is intensely hot, liquid. Then we have the mantle, intensely hot, it's solid. Then we have the mantle, which is liquid and extremely hot, not quite as hot, but it's molten. And then we have the crust made up of rock and soil, and the outermost is what we're really using. So, and then the biosphere is all living parts, and and it pretty much overlaps the three. You know, we have life in the air, we have life in the water, and we have life in the ground. So the greenhouse effect is one of the things we would like to talk about. Now, this is not global warming. I just want to make sure you understand the Earth would be extremely cold without these layers. We have a layer of carbon dioxide and other gases that trap heat on the planet to make it livable. So it's a good thing. And so solar energy comes in, hits, and then goes back up, and then some of it bounces off. But there is a layer here that actually traps in that warmth, bounces off the clouds, and allows the Earth to be a temperature that we can, that life has evolved with and that we can tolerate. All right, and then we have this hierarchy, and I want you to know the hierarchy, especially starting with kind of the organism level. You know, we're made up of cells, and I guess that's important for biology, but with this class, we really are talking about the organism level and above. And so you got organisms, you got populations, you got communities, you got ecosystems. For biomes, that would fit right in here, and then we have the biosphere. So I want you to know the definition. So obviously an organism is an individual, that's easy. Then we have populations, that's a group of individuals of a single species. We have communities, which is a group of individuals of several different species interacting. And then we have an ecosystem, which is a group of individuals of different species interacting with each other and including the abiotic. So we have biotic, which is living stuff, abiotic, that is non-living. So the ecosystem adds in the abiotic factors. And then the biosphere is basically where every living thing is. And again, biomes would be these large areas like a desert, and that has some typical communities they talk about. There, you know, the desert would, again, like I mentioned, cactus. But there are some other things in the desert. The desert's defined as less than 10 inches of rain a year. And you could have a desert biome which has the cactus garden or whatever you want to call that area. But then there's also you know, some what we call washes, you know, where temporary water goes through. There's oases in there. So there's different ecosystems that break up those biomes. And so then the biosphere is, again, all living things. So know those definitions. And then we're going to talk about the food chain versus the food web. So over here we have a food chain, and that's kind of what started being talked about in some of the elementary schools, where you have trophic levels. Trophic means to feed. And so we have solar energy coming down, and then we have our first trophic level. Those are called producers. These are autotroph, self-feeders. Trophic means to feed again, auto means self. So these are plants, some bacteria, anything that can photosynthesize and make sugars. And so what you're seeing down here on the bottom is the equation for photosynthesis. Taking carbon dioxide and water, adding solar energy, and producing glucose and a waste product, which is oxygen, which we need to breathe. And then cellular respiration, where we break down sugars, is actually the opposite. All right, so I want you to know the trophic levels. And so we have the producer. So second trophic level is a primary consumer. It's an herbivore. It's anything that eats plants. We got the third trophic level, our secondary consumer. They eat animals that eat plants. And then we have a tertiary consumer, which is an animal that eats an animal that eats an animal that eats plants. So you can see as we go, you know, there are different levels. Life is a little more complicated, and this would be considered a food web, where animals can jump levels depending on what they are eating. So we're going to move here, and then at the very end of a food web or a food chain, some of the most important organisms, as we mentioned before, could include insects, but doesn't have to. Could be fungus, could be bacteria. And these would be things that are decomposers, that feed on and digest parts of decaying organic material. Okay, so we have decomposers, that are breaking things down. So we're not in a pile of dead things. That is a good thing. So here's a food web, again, food chain, and this is a different one and a little more complex than this would be an aquatic one. But I want you to know what we call the 10% rule. So if we go back to this picture, what I want you to know, solar energy comes in. It gives off a lot of energy. Okay, so here's our problem. Actually, it turns out plants are photosynthetic. They're great when we need them, but they're only really 1% effective. So 1% of that solar energy that hits the planet is converted into sugars, food. All right, after that, every time that you move down move up a trophic level, you lose energy in the form of heat. We're not that efficient. So it's called the 10% rule. So if the sugar makes this amount of energy, the primary consumers only get 10% of that. 90% is given off as heat. And then the secondary consumers are getting 10% of the original 10%. And then the tertiary is getting 10% of the 10% of the 10% of technically the 1%. So you can see as you move up a food chain or a food web, the animals on top require a lot more food to get the energy they need. And the reason I bring that up is we'll talk about food later. And one of the ways that we could be better on the environment is just eating what we say lower on the food chain, becoming a vegetarian or becoming a vegan. What you're doing is you're bypassing some of that energy loss. So if I was to, let's say, I have an acre of land. We're going to just make some numbers up here. And let's say on that acre of land, I can raise enough food to feed 10 people if they eat the crops that I am raising. Okay, here's the problem. If they decide, hey, I want to eat meat, what that then means is that same amount of land, if I'm raising that food for a cow, it means I can only feed one person. And so that would be the 10% rule. So if everybody ate less meat, we would be able to feed more people. All right, and then the last thing I want to do here is look at net primary productivity. So I really want you to kind of key in. Don't memorize all this, but I want you to see what are the terrestrial primary productivity, what are kind of the best terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that produce the most energy. And if you look, the first one and first two are swamps and marshes, and the second one is tropical rainforests. So they have the highest primary productivity, and then they also have some of the most species. And then if you drop down on the bottom of the aquatic estuaries, which an estuary is where salt and water mix, and same thing, very high in net productivity. So definitely know those three for sure. All right, and we will stop the share and stop the recording.